There are certain companies that, yes, they provide a plethora of privacy choices, but they aren't centralized. They're deep in menus. They are confusing when it comes to, if you click this checkbox, does it mean that I'm opted out or opted in? You've probably seen this.
Today's topic, Ron, we're going to dig right into it. The $100 million mistake. I mean, I think you can think of some big brands that have gone through some lawsuits when it comes to data privacy and collecting
what
personal.
Big brand hasn't, at this point?
Good point. Exactly. So the first question to kind of dig into this is, we see this time and time again. Companies are getting into hot water with data collection. What are some of your inadequate practices that you would recommend to avoid these types of situations as a company?
That's a really good question, Cam. And honestly, what I see with all of these kind of high-level breaches and things that are coming out in the media, the media tends to focus on the lack of transparency. For example, not having clear ways in which consumers can operationalize their choices. This concept of dark patterns, when companies try to steer you one way versus another to make you divulge personal information that you might not want to, right? Whether it's a opt-out checkbox that might not be as prominent or language that is misleading. I think that lack of transparency gets companies into hot water 99% of the time. And then also, a lot of the more specific things around the consent choices that are provided and the lack of granularity, you'll see from like time and time again as something that's considered violative. So not giving consumers the ability to opt out of specific purposes for which their data is collected and used, and just having blanket consent statements, missteps by companies. So I think it's really important that companies provide me as much granularity as possible when it comes to how they process my personal information, whether it's used for marketing, AI training, or whether they might be using sensitive personal information about me. But those are all things that you're required to get consent for typically. But I think it's really best practice for companies to be providing me with really granular consent controls. I think transparency and choice are really where companies get into hot water.
I want to go deeper into this, Ron. So you've worked at some pretty big companies as CPO. Have you ever run across maybe changing how that process should be? I'm sure you have. I mean, you've probably had to come in and build something from the ground up. What's an example of a bad consent practice compared to something that you've improved it to, if that makes sense?
That's a great question. There are some laws that require you to get granular consent for each processing activity.
Yeah.
And in my previous roles, I was required to work with the product team and the engineering team to operationalize consent for specific purposes. And there was one point, unfortunately, where we had to have 3 or 4 checkboxes during registration or user registration. And that was just as a result of complying with these laws that require that granular consent. While I agree that companies should be providing granular consent controls and it's driven by legal requirements, I think it's just really good data stewardship and good for consumers to demonstrate to them that they have controls over discrete uses of their personal information. You can do that through things like not only checkboxes, but like through a preference center or a centralized place where I can control how a company uses my personal information and have it be really accessible and really clear.
That's a great point, because I think it was you that actually said this. I don't know where exactly, because you do a lot of speaking events and stuff, but just a little bit.
Just a few events here and there.
Just a smidge. You said something about how their organizations should turn to making privacy more of a choice. Like companies should start replicating what apps do. You know what I'm saying? You know where I'm getting?
Yeah. So there was a thought piece that I drafted where I said that user privacy controls should be as easy as that swipe gesture that you see on a popular dating app. Yeah. And that's something I truly believe in. I think that companies should be making the ability for consumers to engage and operationalize their choices as easy as it would any other functionality of an app or service or product or whatever it is. It
Right.
shouldn't be hidden behind layers of menus. And I won't say which company it is, but there are certain companies that, yes, they provide a plethora of privacy choices, but they aren't centralized. They're deep in menus. They are confusing when it comes to, if you click this checkbox, does it mean that I'm opted out or opted in?
Right.
You've probably seen this,
Every day.
in your experiences. So I think that companies should be focusing on developing user privacy controls that are as user friendly, straightforward, as common sense as the features and services that they provide users day to day. I think it just makes sense. And to be providing those choices from the get-go, from the point of
Right.
data collection, this concept of just-in-time privacy notices and choices is really something that I am a proponent of, for sure.